The bay mare tried to bite through the auction rope before the sheriff could finish naming her price, and Nora Whitcomb stepped under the rail and put up $7 she had no business spending, while every man in the sale yard laughed like they had just watched a widow lose the last of her good sense. The animal was all ribs and temper and winter scars. The old cavalry saddle on her back slumped crooked from one snapped cinch, and still Nora could not take her eyes off the way the mare planted her feet against the dust, as if she had not agreed to belong to anybody yet. Why a horse that knew better hands had ended up in a dead drover's sale for less than a decent pair of boots was one question. Why the mare kept turning her head toward Nora, of all people, was another. Nora did not answer the laughter. She never wasted breath where bread money was concerned. She counted out the coins from her apron pocket, felt the thinness of the cloth where she had mended it twice already, and took the lead rope before Sheriff Pell could change his mind. The noon air smelled of hot plank, horse sweat, and the burnt sugar drifting from Mrs. Boone's pies cooling 3 doors down, and the sound of flies along the fence had that dry summer meanness to it that made a person think of unpaid notes. If this story finds you while the dishes are drying or the house has gone quiet, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because the Old West was built as much from lonely kitchens as from open range, and this one begins with a woman everybody in Larkspur had mistaken for finished. Hank Dewar, who rode point for Harlan Bristow and acted as though the town itself had been deeded to him with Bristow's grazing land, leaned on the top rail and spat into the dust near Nora's boot. "Cheap horse for a cheap season," he said. "Then it suits us both," Nora said, and led the mare away before he could think of anything uglier. She moved with the quick, economical steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation invited help, and help invited advice, and advice from men like Hank Dewar came tied to contempt. The mare tested her twice on the road out, once by shying at a laundry sheet snapping on a line, once by trying to crowd her into the ditch, but Nora set a firm hand against the animal's neck and gave her no more force than was needed. She had been reading leather and horseflesh since girlhood, could tell by the smell of a harness whether it had been oiled with care or neglect, and the mare's tack bothered her more with every mile. The saddle itself was worn, yes, but not poor. Good stitching ran along the skirts in neat, deliberate lines. Somebody careful had owned it once. Somebody who knew the difference between rough work and hidden work. The mare stood still at the hitching post while Nora cut away the rotten cinch and slid the old saddle free. That alone was strange enough to make her pause. Mean horses did not turn mannerly without reason. She laid the saddle across the porch rail, lifted the blanket, and felt something hard where no hard thing ought to be. Not the tree, not a broken rivet. This weight had been stitched into the underside between the worn shearling and the leather panel, hidden close as a secret against the horse's back. Nora fetched her awl from the kitchen shelf, slipped the point under the thread, and opened 3 tight stitches. An oilskin packet slid into her palm with the dull, certain heaviness of money. There were 6 $20 gold pieces in a velvet pouch, wrapped so snugly they made almost no sound. Beneath them lay 3 folded documents, a narrow ledger strip torn from a larger book, and an envelope with her name written across the front in a hand she did not know. Nora sat down hard on the porch step without meaning to. For a moment the whole yard went very still except for the ticking click of the cooling stove through the open kitchen door and the mare blowing softly at her shoulder, as if she had carried that weight for a long time and was relieved to be quit of it. Nora broke the seal with a thumb gone dry. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the letter said, "if this mare reaches you, trust what is sewn and not what is spoken. Mr. Bristow has bought the county's paper by the ounce. Enclosed is enough coin to buy you a little time and enough proof to buy the truth if you are brave with it. I send it to you because once, last winter, you repaired my saddle strap in the alley behind Ketter's store and took no payment after you saw my hands shaking from cold. A person remembers who treats him like he is still a person. The full book is hidden at Dry Cedar Line Camp beneath the grain bin. Do not show this letter to Sheriff Pell. Do not show it to Hank Dewar. If I have not come by now, I will not be coming. The mare knows the way better than any man. Miguel Serrano. Luke. His absence came to her the way weather came over open land. First a coolness, then a pressure, then the whole sky changed. He had died believing Bristow was choking small ranchers off the creek by force and false filing, and nobody had been able to prove it. Nora had spent 2 years swallowing every slight the town could wrap in politeness. There went poor Luke's widow, trying to keep stock alive on water that wasn't rightly hers. There she was, clever with a needle because Providence had not seen fit to give her better use. There she was, too proud to remarry, too stubborn to sell. The papers in her lap felt hot as iron. She had just hidden the packet beneath the false bottom of the flour bin when hoofs sounded in the yard. Hank Dewar rode in with another Bristow hand beside him, both men too easy in their saddles for a neighborly call. Nora stepped back onto the porch and wiped her palms on her skirt. Hank nodded toward the mare. "Bristow heard you bought a bag of bones today," he said. "He collects old cavalry tack. Says he'll give you $20 for the horse and whatever's on her." Nora let the silence stretch long enough to make him work. "That saddle's half rotted. So is half the county. Still worth owning." She could feel the second man looking past her shoulder toward the open door, weighing what might be seen inside. Nora kept her voice flat. "Horse is not for sale." Hank smiled the way some men do when they think patience itself is a kind of threat. "Miguel Serrano used to ride that mare. Folks found blood in his camp this morning. If he left anything tucked where it shouldn't be, it belongs to Mr. Bristow." The yard changed shape around those words. Nora heard the wind push through the cottonwoods by the creek, heard the porch board under her heel give its familiar small complaint, heard the mare stamp once behind the house. Hank saw something move across her face and mistook it for fear. "Dawn," he said, "that's how long you have to think practical." They searched her barn an hour later, not with a warrant, but with the confidence men borrow when law and money keep the same company. Nora let them look at harness pegs, grain sacks, Luke's old branding irons, the empty shelf where she stored winter apples. She kept her breathing steady and her eyes bored. When they finally rode off, taking nothing and promising nothing, twilight had laid purple in the draw and the first bats were working the yard. Nora stood in the kitchen with Miguel's letter open on the table and knew two plain things. Bristow would not wait for morning if he grew impatient, and a woman alone holding papers men were willing to kill for had already crossed the point where staying home counted as safety. She took the packet, buckled Luke's revolver at her waist, saddled the mare herself, and rode into the dark toward Gideon Shaw's forge because there was no one else in Calder County she trusted to tell her the truth, even when it hurt. Gideon Shaw kept his forge a mile east of town, where the road bent past a stand of blackjack pine, and the creek widened enough to turn his wheel in spring. By midnight the fire had burned low to a red eye in the dark, but Gideon heard Nora coming before she called. He always heard horses first. When he opened the door, lamplight laid one side of his face in gold and left the other cut in shadow, which suited a man who had spent the last 8 years acting as though half his life had ended with the other half still walking around inside it. He wore his dark hair longer than fashion, more from indifference than vanity, and one shoulder still held higher than the other from the stampede that had crushed his younger brother and left Gideon with a limp he refused to acknowledge in words. Nora held out Miguel's letter before she said hello. That was how he knew the night had run past ordinary trouble. He read without interrupting, then turned the paper over and studied the back as if the fibers themselves might add testimony. "Come in," he said. Inside, the forge room smelled of coal dust, hot metal gone cool, and the sharp, clean note of linseed oil. Gideon cleared a place on the workbench with 2 careful sweeps of his forearm. Nora laid out the tax receipts, the ledger strip, the coins. When he saw Luke's name on the water right filing, his mouth tightened. He had ridden with Luke once in younger years, before Bristow's cattle contracts grew fat enough to choke every smaller man in the county. Gideon had also ridden 3 seasons for Bristow, until the day Bristow ordered a river crossing in High Run and Gideon's brother Sam vanished under 12 screaming head of cattle and brown water. Gideon had stayed afterward. That was the shame of it. He had stayed long enough to take wages from the man whose hurry had buried his brother in silt. "The handwriting's Miguel's," he said at last. "I shod that mare in April. He kept asking for a shoe with more grab on the hind left. Said she climbed like a cat when she cared to." Nora watched him instead of the papers. "If this is enough to stop Bristow, say so. It's enough to make him nervous." Gideon tapped the torn ledger strip. "Not enough to break him unless the full book says what Miguel claims. Dry Cedar Line Camp." He nodded once. "North Ridge beyond the Alkali Flat." She looked at the coins. $120 would clear the note on my heifers and buy feed through first frost. Gideon did not speak. That was one of the things about him. He never softened a hard truth by rushing into it. Nora hated him a little for waiting. If I pay my debt and burn the rest, Bristow still swallows the creek. Only slower. And if you ride for the book, Gideon said, he knows you are not a widow minding her own fence anymore. Gideon pulled the damaged saddle closer, ran his fingertips along the cut seam, and gave a quiet breath through his nose. Whoever hid this new leather? Better than most men know lying. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. He fetched wax thread and an awl from a drawer. Some things hold because they were made well. Some hold because they've been mended honest. The lines settled in the room between the hiss of the lamp and the far-off creek, simple enough to miss if you were not listening closely. Nora looked at his hands, broad and scarred and patient over the leather, and thought how many things in this county had been kept together by people no one thought to praise while louder men took credit for standing upright. Gideon restitched the cut panel, slower on account of an old break in his smallest finger, and when he was done the seam looked untouched. We should copy the strip before daylight, he said. And if you mean to ride for Dry Cedar, you don't ride alone. She lifted her head. Bristow's not just buying paper. He owns fear. Ride with me, and he'll collect from you too. He's been collecting from me since 1886. Gideon set the saddle aside. I'm tired of paying. They went by the back path to Tessa Boone's boarding-house kitchen because Tessa could keep her mouth shut with more reliability than most men kept a promise. She was up kneading bread at 1 a.m, as widows often are when sleep no longer bargains fair, and one of her pale eyes watered from an old stove flare that had scorched the lid. She took one look at Nora's face, another at Gideon's, and said only, "Table's clean." By the time the copies were made, Tessa had coffee boiled black enough to wake the dead and a heel of ham warming in the pan. She asked no questions until the third cup, and even then the question was not what they held, but whether they were sure they wanted the trouble that came with being right in public. By noon Bristow made his move without dirtying his own boots. A bank notice came tacked to Nora's gate. Payment due immediately on one overdue equipment note she did not even know had been accelerated. An hour later Sheriff Pell rode out with a courteous warning about stolen property being easier surrendered than discovered. Then Harlan Bristow himself sent a message through the telegraph boy, "Let us be sensible. Come see me at the hotel parlor before supper." Nora read the neat line twice and handed it back unread to everyone but herself. Sensible was a word men used when they wanted a woman to dress surrender up as maturity. When the boy had gone, she found Gideon behind the forge with bedrolls, jerky, and the repaired saddle. The bay mare stood ready, ears forward, as if the decision had been waiting on them rather than the other way around. Nora checked Luke's revolver, though she prayed not to need it. Gideon slung a carbine into the scabbard and settled into his saddle with that slight hitch in his weight he would never discuss. The afternoon had gone white-hot and windless, the sort of heat that made every sound carry farther than it should. At the edge of town Nora looked back once. Tessa was on her boarding-house porch shaking out a tablecloth. Alma Reed stood in the recorder's doorway with her hands pressed flat against the jamb, watching. Neither waved. Neither turned away. And because sometimes a story must pause long enough to ask the thing beating inside it. Let me ask you this before they ride farther into the hard part. If protecting what is yours means staying quiet while a wrong grows teeth in your neighbor's field, what do you call that in the end? Prudence or surrender by smaller pieces? Nora did not have a name for it yet. She only knew she could not stomach it. Miguel had been right about the mare. She pulled straight for the shed and stopped with her nose against the feed bin, blowing softly. Nora and Gideon pried the warped boards aside and found a tin box wrapped in canvas beneath 3 inches of stale oats and mouse droppings. Bristow's name was nowhere on the lid. Men like him liked their sins tidy. But inside lay a full account book, 2 duplicate filings bearing the county seal, and 6 sworn statements signed by ranchers who had paid water fees twice and been told they owed a third time besides. One statement was Luke Whitcomb's. Nora knew his hand before the lantern light reached the name. Her knees went weak so fast she had to catch the edge of the bin. Luke had written that Bristow diverted county survey work to erase small claims from the creek and threatened winter feed contracts against anyone who protested. He had written that if harm came to him, The papers should go to a court outside Calder County because no office inside it remained clean. Nora had not known he ever put those words down. He had died with fever in his lungs and apology on his mouth for leaving her with too much work. All this while there had also been this. Proof he had seen clear to the heart of the thing and tried to leave a road through it. Gideon looked up from the account book. We were never meant to find only the strip. Miguel wanted us to know the book existed. The packet buys time. The book wins. A hoof knocked against the trough outside. They went silent together. Another sound followed, the easy slide of leather against leather, men dismounting without hurry. Nora snuffed the lantern. Through the crack in the plank wall she saw 3 horses, then 4. One belonged to Harlan Bristow, who rode a tall gray with a silver-mounted breast collar because modesty had never once tripped him on the road to vanity. His voice came smooth through the dark. "Nora," he called. "You'll forgive the inconvenience. I was hoping you'd choose money. It makes for quieter evenings." She held Luke's statement against her breast. Gideon moved toward the rear wall, favoring his bad leg less, when danger gave him no time to remember it. Bristow spoke again, not louder. "You were never the problem." Luke had ideas above his acreage. Miguel had an immigrant's habit of mistaking kindness for equality. Men like that complicate sound management. Nora felt something cold and clean settle through her, cleaner than rage. "You stole water from men who prayed for rain over dead calves," she said through the boards. "Call it management again." There was a brief pause, and when Bristow answered, his amusement had thinned. "I call it survival. Big outfits survive dry years. Little ones drown the county in sentiment and unpaid notes. Step out and hand me the book. I'll see you keep your house." That was his mistake. Not the threat. The offer. The assumption that every person had a price if only it was named politely enough. Nora glanced at Gideon. He pointed once toward the rear shutter. The old mare, bless her bitter soul, had moved off from the front. She was somewhere beyond the shed wall, making no noise at all. The first shot splintered through the door before they reached the shutter. Wood burst inward. Nora ducked, the ledger clutched under her arm, and Gideon kicked the loose panel free. They went through in a spill of chaff and dust. Another rifle cracked. Something hot grazed Nora's sleeve. The night smelled of alkali, dry cedar, and the first bitter thread of smoke. Bristow's men had thrown a lantern at the bunkhouse roof. "Right," Gideon barked. They did. The mare leapt forward with Nora low over her neck, sure-footed even in the dark scrub. Gideon's gelding hit a wash and stumbled, recovered, drove on. Behind them fire lifted with a hungry roar, turning the line camp orange against the black hills. For one breath, in that hellish light, Nora saw Harlan Bristow standing beside his gray with no hat on, his face not enraged but irritated, like a man forced to dirty gloves meant for dinner. They might have made clean distance if Gideon's gelding had not taken a bullet low in the hindquarter. The horse lurched. Gideon swore, swung free before it went down, and hit the ground hard enough to lose the carbine from his grip. Nora circled back, because leaving him was not a choice living people made and remained able to live with. He shoved the reins at her. "Take the book. Get up. Take it." She half dropped, half fell from the saddle, and dragged him by the coat collar toward a cut in the hillside where rain had bitten out a pocket of earth. Hooves thundered below. Smoke rolled over the ridge now, pushed by a wind that had finally decided to arrive. Gideon's leg buckled once, then held. Together they scrambled into the shelter, just as flames from the burning grass licked up the slope. Not a great dramatic storm from heaven, no helpful cloudburst, just the plain terror of summer fire doing what summer fire does when men feed it with carelessness and spite. For a minute the world shrank to sparks, heat, and breath. Nora pressed herself against the dirt wall, hand locked around Luke's statement inside her shirt, while Gideon beat at a lick of flame on his sleeve. The mare stood above them on the ridge, black against the fireglow, refusing to bolt. Bristow's riders had pulled back from the flames, but they were still there, waiting, smart enough not to burn with the evidence if patience could do the work cheaper. When the worst of the fire slid past into the wash below, Gideon checked the ledger. The canvas was singed. The outer pages had blackened at the corners. One folded filing fell apart in his hands, half the county seal turning to ash under his thumb. He closed his eyes exactly once. Then he opened them and looked at Nora in the strange red light. "We still have Luke's statement. We still have the receipts. Maybe enough. Maybe is a poor rope. It's the one we've got. Below them, Bristow called up from the dark, all velvet again, now that Flame had done its screaming for him. Dawn, Nora. Come morning, you'll walk into town carrying half a story and a wounded man. I'll walk in wearing a clean shirt. Tell me which of us the county will believe. The question stayed with them the rest of the ride. Gideon's arm went over Nora's shoulders when the trail narrowed. Nora led the limping gelding from her saddle and kept the mare under both of them because the animal seemed built of refusal more than flesh. They reached Tessa Boone's back gate just before sunrise, smoke-soaked and ash-marked, and carrying a ledger that might not be whole enough to save a chicken coop, let alone a valley. And that, dear heart, is where a person learns whether truth is a blade or only a burden, because by first light Bristow had arranged a foreclosure hearing at the bank for noon, and the most important page in Miguel's book was ash on Gideon's sleeve. Tessa did not waste time with exclamations. She got Gideon to the washroom bench, cut his shirt from the shoulder where the grays had laid it open, and sent Caleb Dunn sprinting for Dr. Wells with orders sharp enough to make the boy forget he was half-deaf. Nora washed soot from Luke's statement at the pump one careful drop at a time, then spread the surviving papers on Tessa's kitchen table between a crock of butter and yesterday's breadboard. Morning light showed every loss with cruel clarity. The ledger was readable in patches. The duplicate filing had kept its parcel number, but lost the signature line. Enough to suggest fraud. Not enough, Nora feared, to pin it down where a judge could not wriggle. You should have let me stay on that ridge, he said. Nora kept her eyes on the page she was aligning. No, you could have outrun them. And then what? When the county and lose the only man who told me the truth before it was useful. Alma Reed came through the back door an hour later, had askew, breathing like she had walked too fast, and argued with herself the whole way. She set an envelope on the table. Inside was a copied notice of the noon hearing and a penciled note. Bank intends immediate seizure if filing proof fails. Alma would not meet Nora's eye. I shouldn't be here, she said. Mr. Bristow has been at the recorder's office since first light. He asked who knew Miguel's hand. He asked whether any copies went out last night. Gideon shifted to stand, and Tessa put him back in the chair with one look. Nora said, Did you answer? Alma's throat worked. I said I keep too many books to remember one page from another. There it was, the tremble beneath plain speech. Alma had 2 children and a father who needed laudanum for his lungs. She earned $12 a month and the privilege of being ignored. Nora could have used her. Could have asked her to swear she had seen duplicate filings altered after the fact. Could have pulled one more frightened witness into the light and made Bristow burn extra hot. Instead, Nora unfolded Miguel's tiny scrap, tore off the bottom corner where Alma's name was written, and fed that corner into Tessa's stove flame until it curled black and vanished. Then she folded the rest and slid the hearing notice back toward Alma. You were not here, she said. Alma blinked. Mrs. Whitcomb, if you fail at noon. If I fail at noon, I fail with the people I chose, not the ones I dragged. Alma's eyes went wet, though she mastered it before the tears could fall. She left with her hands empty and her chin steadier than when she arrived. Gideon watched the closed door a long moment. You could have had more from her, he said. I could have taken it. Nora looked down at Luke's statement, at Miguel's careful letter, at the scorched ledger. That's not the same thing. The room held quiet for a while, warm and flower-dusted and honest. Nora gathered the remaining papers into order while Gideon turned a little brass compass Tessa had set by his hand. When Sam died, I kept thinking I'd speak up next time. Next bad thing. Next man leaning too hard on smaller people. I made a whole religion of next time. His thumb moved over the cracked glass. Turns out next time is how cowardice dresses for church. Nora sat down across from him. She had not been still beside a man in years without feeling herself brace. With Gideon, the bracing had gone out of it so gradually she had not noticed until it was gone. She reached for the compass and closed his fingers over it. Then let this be this time. He laughed once, quietly, because pain and relief sometimes share a border. You make it sound simple. No. She looked at the bandage at his shoulder, the smoke still ground into the lines of his hands. I make it sound worth doing. His gaze lifted to hers and did not slide away. You ever think maybe broken people ought to keep to their own corners? Spare everybody the trouble. Nora felt the whole long road of the last 2 years in that question. Luke's empty side of the bed. Supper for one. The way town women lowered their voices around her, as though widowhood were catching. The way men either pitied her or wanted her practical. Never once simply wanted her company. She gave Gideon the truest thing she had. You don't wait to be unbroken before you let somebody sit beside you. It was small when she said it. Barely more than the sound of a door opening in another room. Gideon shut his eyes for one heartbeat and let the words land. When he opened them again, something in his face had eased that had been clenched there for years. If that touched a place in you that life keeps tender, stay with me a moment and go on and leave a like or subscribe before the hard part finishes. Because stories like this are for people who know quiet courage often goes unthanked while it is happening, and it matters that somebody remembers. Tessa remembered. Nora remembered. Gideon was learning how. By 11, the town had filled the bank porch and half the street besides. Folks came because foreclosure was public theater in small places, and because Bristow's name drew a crowd the way a thrown stone draws rings in water. The heat had broken, leaving the air sharp with dust and distant smoke from the burned line camp. Nora rode in on the bay mare with the repaired saddle under her, Gideon beside her on Tessa's old sorrel because his gelding could not be moved. Tessa followed in her apron and bonnet, as if she were attending quilting rather than war. There is power in a woman who shows up carrying ordinary domesticity into an extraordinary fight. It tells cruel men the world they are trying to own has witnesses. Harlan Bristow stood on the bank steps in a linen coat too fine for the county and not a speck of soot on him. Sheriff Pell kept one hand near his holster and his expression near boredom. The bank manager, Wilkes, held the foreclosure papers ready. Bristow inclined his head to Nora with a courtesy that would have fooled a city full of strangers. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, I regret this display. Had you come to me privately, we might have handled things in a way that preserved your dignity. Nora dismounted without looking at him. If dignity was what you meant to preserve, you'd have started with your own. Inside the bank, the air smelled of ledger ink, wool coats, and the damp metallic scent old safes hold year-round. Judge Harrow had been fetched from the next county on account of Bristow wanting his seizure to look official enough nobody could call it theft by another name. Harrow was a broad-faced man with spectacles that slid when he sweated and a reputation for loving procedure the way some men loved children. Nora counted that in her favor. Greedy men thrive in shadow. Procedure likes daylight. Wilkes began with the note, the arrears, the disputed water filing. Bristow's counsel, a narrow man from Casper with cuffs too white for local travel, spoke smoothly of confusion, regrettable errors, documents lost in previous office fires. Then Nora laid Miguel's letter on the table. She laid Luke's statement beside it. She laid the original tax receipt and the water right filing down one by one, not dramatic, just exact. Gideon added the scorched ledger and named the dry cedar line camp. Tessa testified that Bristow's riders had searched Nora's place without warrant the night before. Each fact by itself was a fence post. Together they began to look like a boundary nobody decent could pretend not to see. Bristow waited until they had finished and then smiled the tired smile of a man indulging children with strong opinions. He pointed out the missing signature line. He questioned Miguel Serrano's whereabouts. He suggested Luke Whitcomb, God rest him, had written his statement while fevered. He let sympathy thicken just enough around Nora's widowhood to make grief sound like unreliability. It was clever. It might even have worked. Nora felt the room tilt toward the easier story, the powerful man with clean cuffs and continuous records, or the woman with ash on her hem and half-burned papers held together by hope. Then Alma Reed stood up from the back bench. She did not do it grandly. She rose the way schoolteachers rise to correct a date. Her hat ribbon had come loose. Ink marked the side of her finger. All the fragile parts of her were still plainly present, which is maybe why courage looked so unmistakable when it came. I can speak to the filings, she said. Bristow turned in visible surprise. Not outrage. Surprise. Men like him never imagine the quiet people are where the trouble will come from. Judge Harrow peered over his spectacles. State your office. Deputy Recorder, Calder County. Alma swallowed and continued. Mr. Bristow brought in amended parcel entries on 3 occasions and asked that prior water right notations be recopied due to damage. I recopied what I was told to copy. Later I found the originals still intact in the lower file cabinet. Mr. Serrano saw them once while delivering a tax roll. After that, the originals vanished. Mrs. Whitcomb did not compel me to speak. In fact, she refused to. That last part mattered. Nora could feel it matter. Heads in the room turned not just toward Alma, but toward Nora, as if recalculating the shape of a woman they had been content to underestimate. Alma went on, voice steadier now that truth had found its legs. I kept a pocket memorandum for dates because Mr. Wilkes's office often misplaced receipt timing. It shows Luke Whitcomb paid his second tax 2 weeks before the delinquency notice was issued. I have it here. She set the little memorandum book on the table. The crowd exhaled as one body. Not a cheer. Better. Recognition. The kind that arrives when evidence becomes too plain to insult. Bristow tried once more. He spoke of clerical confusion, of inefficient offices, of charitable efforts to stabilize dry country ranching. But it was over the moment Judge Harrow compared Alma's dates to Nora's original receipt and found the county stamp numbers consecutive where Wilkes's books showed a gap. Procedure had daylight now. Daylight did what it does. The foreclosure was stayed on the spot. The water right seizure was suspended pending full review in Cheyenne. Judge Harrow ordered Sheriff Pell to secure Bristow's county files and Wilkes's private ledgers for audit. Pell hesitated long enough to expose himself, and in that hesitation the crowd saw more than any speech could have proved. Bristow saw them see it. His power did not vanish in thunder. It thinned. You could almost hear the stitching go. Mr. Bristow, Judge Harrow said, until this is reviewed, you are not to touch disputed acreage or equipment at Cottonwood Draw, nor to issue instruction through your men regarding said property. Bristow stood very still. Men built like him do not often experience irrelevance arriving in public. For the first time that day, he looked older than his coat. He turned to Nora, perhaps expecting triumph, cruelty, some little grab at vengeance he might recognize. What he found was worse for him than either. Nora did not gloat. She did not list the harm. She did not ask the room to love her now that it was safe. She only said, "You had enough," and still kept reaching. Several people heard it. Several more felt the weight of it without needing the words repeated. Bristow opened his mouth, closed it, and stepped aside because stepping aside had become the only dignified motion left to him. That was his punishment more than handcuffs would have been. Not ruin. Removal from the center of things. By autumn the creek rights were restored, the note rewritten honest, and the bay mare stayed at Cottonwood Draw. Nora named her Mercy, because she had carried it hidden when the county had nearly run out. 3 years on, at branding time, the yard at Cottonwood Draw rang with ordinary sounds no one in trouble ever thinks to pray for until they return. Calves bawling, irons clinking in the fire, Tessa scolding someone for tracking mud, Gideon laughing low at the young hands trying to look competent. Nora came out of the house carrying a plate of biscuits and paused on the porch because the sight still had power to catch her unprepared. Not happiness as lightning. Happiness as something sturdier. Built. Used. Shared. Gideon reached the steps at the same moment and took the plate from her before she could protest. Their fingers brushed. His hand lingered just enough to say what no one there needed said aloud. He looked out over the pasture where Mercy grazed near the spring with a sorrel colt nosing at her flank, and then back at Nora. "Worth keeps its own time," he said. "It shows up plain once the dust settles." By evening the last of the sun had gone honey-colored on the cottonwoods, and out beyond the porch the bay mare lowered her head beside the water she had led back to them, while the light lay across the pasture like a hand that meant to stay. And if you've a mind for another tomorrow night, I'll tell you about the widow who gave shelter to a blind drifter during a sleet storm and woke to find his coat stitched with army maps no living man should still have carried. Until then, rest easy.